Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 5 of the course. Kind of hard to believe, but we're actually halfway through the course at the end of this week, so we're moving fast. A few announcements to get us started. First, I apologize about the audio and the video last week. I'm still not exactly sure what happened with that. I just didn't have time to go back and re-record it, so I apologize for that. But hopefully we're going to be good this time. Yeah, also I just wanted to, give my condolences, and say how sorry I was to hear about the shooting in Orlando. Hopefully none of you were personally affected by that, but I know we were all upset by what had happened for any number of reasons. Um, so so yeah. As we are halfway through the course at the end of this week, there's going to be a midterm exam this week. Um, I'm going to open it up probably Thursday or Friday, and you guys have until Saturday at midnight to finish it. Um, it is a combination of true, false, multiple choice, and short answer, short essay questions. When I say short essay, I mean 2 to 3 paragraphs, something along those lines. Um, it's closed book, right? Now I know we're in an online class, and it's difficult for me to monitor you to make sure that you're not using your books or any sort of external materials. So, um, I'm not going to require you to do the online proctoring thing. Um, but please don't use your books. And this will be especially evident to me if you do decide to use your books. It'll be pretty evident, or external materials, it'll be pretty evident in the short answer questions, right? Because at this point, I have a good sense of your writing style and where you are as far as comprehending the material. So if I see some quote dropped in that's sort of could be written by a graduate student or something like that, I'll know things are not exactly right. So anyway, please don't do that. The material is just going to cover what we've covered up until the end of this week, right? So um, the stuff on the state of nature from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And then this week, Hobbes's discussion of the sovereign, essentially. Sorry, I have a bit of a sore throat, so I may have to drink more water than I normally do. Also, because this is a summer session and we're moving through pretty fast, your final papers will be due in a little bit over a month. So you guys definitely need to start thinking about that. I'll post a list of suggested topics, but also if you guys want to choose one of your own topics, send me an email, and we can try to go through some topics and sort of what you have in mind. Okay, so last week we were looking at Rousseau and sort of his take on on the state of nature, and how it was quite different than Hobbes and Locke, and he actually saw man as being inherently good in the state of nature, right? But it's this acquisition of property, this increase of technology, the social inequalities that come along with being a part of modern society that end up corrupting man, right? And for him it's also a moral thing, because he has sort of these two and three potentially really important moral concepts that relates to the progress of society. One is amour de soi, which means love of the self, right? So like self-preservation, like you think about, Hobbes talking about self-preservation, what you have to do to survive, essentially. So you love yourself in that way. But he thought that as man progressed from sort of the beginning into sort of more modern society, and especially around the time where he talked about when families would come together and they would have dances and concerts, and people would notice, oh, this person's better than me at this, and then inequality comes about. And then competition for sexual, for reproduction and sexual partners and things like that led people to be more concerned about their status, right? And this is something that he called amour propre, right? Which is also love of the self, but rather than love of the protecting yourself, keeping yourself alive, it's sort of love of your reputation, protection of your status, right? And he saw that that was the corrupt moment that occurred from this march to civilization, right? And then he had one other pity, which was essentially a type of compassion or empathy for other people, right? And this was one of the first things that developed, which allows man to actually enter into society. Is that, and he talked about this in the beginning when man's sort of in his infant stages of development. He sort of has an awareness. He or she, they have an awareness of other beings, right? So it's a type of empathy for others, which is a good thing for him. Okay, so he talks about that, right? And he talks about how man, he tells the story about how man starts off, sort of out there as an individual, staying alive, and eventually he encounters other humans, and eventually he finds a mate and has a family, and then families come together, and then they form a village, and then, but then the thing happens where this sort of amour propre comes in, and, people start competing against one another for status. And then that leads to sort of these inventions of agriculture and technology, metallurgy, he calls it. And then, it's all downhill from there, right? So last week I had you guys look at the movie Avatar, which I think does a pretty decent job of capturing a lot of the things that Rousseau is talking about. Starting with the Na'vi, obviously representing the more. Okay, so as you'll notice, I've changed locations. Sorry about that. My wife came in. She was trying to put our daughter down for a nap, so I had to move into the kitchen. Okay, so Rousseau, Avatar, right, and how Avatar sort of represents what the story that Rousseau tells about civilization. Obviously, the Na'vi on the planet, right, Pandora, sort of represent or supposed to represent this, sort of pre-civilization society, right, where they're living sort of in the state of nature. They haven't been corrupted by the sort of self-love. I mean, obviously they have. This is where that distinction comes in between the amour de soi and amour propre. They're still in that sort of amour de soi, and yet they still have the pity, the compassion for other beings, and for the planet itself, right, and the tree and the environment. It's interesting. One of the reasons, because there are lots of movies that have this theme, like Dances with Wolves would be another one. And one of the reasons I chose this particular movie was because of the tree itself, right? And in Rousseau's discussion, he talks about the people dancing around the tree and dancing and singing around the tree, and just reminded me of Avatar. But anyway, yeah. So they represent, right? They represent man, humanity in the state of nature, and then of course, the humans that have come to the planet to mine for this precious metal, unobtainium, right? Represents civilization, and obviously a lot of you brought this up in the discussion. The idea of metallurgy and technology was really on display from from the human side, and then Jake, very interesting character, right? There's a lot of interesting things that you can think about regarding Jake. It's like Jake almost represents both sides of the spectrum. As the movie starts, Jake as a Marine is you see him as sort of a casualty of the civilization, right? Not only physically, but spiritually and psychologically as well. He's damaged by society, the civilization, right? He's been out trying to further the goals of this particular group. But then in a way, when he goes to Pandora to sort of fill in for his brother, he's born again, right? So it's interesting. I mean, it's this idea of him being able to walk again and actually inhabiting a new body, and almost him, he's essentially becoming a new person, right? So he goes back to the beginning in a lot of ways, right? So he walks this very interesting balance between both having knowledge of, the way that society is, um, as far as, on Earth and human society and things like that, but yet he gets to experience the way that it was, before man actually came to that point. So he has this interesting perspective from sort of both sides. I thought you guys made some really good comments on that. Javier talked about how he represents infant man, and I think he does, but he represents infant man already with the consciousness that comes with being a part of a civilized society. So that's the difference. It's interesting. I think about all these different movies that sort of tell the same story, and they always have a character that sort of fits into that mode of Jake, right? So in Dances with Wolves, it's Kevin Costner, who had fought in the Civil War, and he was also damaged, and he sort of came back to the noble state of nature, right, with the Native Americans. And Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, sort of the same thing. He was also a Civil War vet, and rather than being with the Native Americans, he's with the samurai in Japan. So anyway, it's an interesting character. I think it does a pretty good job of sort of representing. I think Rousseau would say, yeah, this is what I'm talking about. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Okay, this week we're moving sort of out of the state of nature and actually into society and different forms of government, different ways that man or people can organize themselves once they actually leave the state of nature. And just as we started the discussion of the state of nature with Hobbes, we're going to start our discussion of different forms of government with Hobbes as well. So let me pull up my slides here. I've got them posted under course files. The file name is Hobbes Sovereign, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Hobbes and this idea of sovereignty, right? So remember, in Hobbes, state of nature is not a good place. It's a place that you don't want to be, right? Because it's a state of perpetual war where life is short and you're nasty, right? So we come together, we give all of our power to a sovereign, right? So now what is the question? So Hobbes starts off chapter 30 by saying that sovereign power can either be in the form of a monarch or an assembly, right? So when we think about Hobbes, at least people who are familiar with Hobbes, you think about, very authoritarian, and people often translate that into it's a monarchy. And there's some evidence in Leviathan to say that Hobbes did prefer a monarchy. But here he says it could be a monarchy or assembly. It doesn't matter, right? The thing that matters for Hobbes is that the sovereign, whether monarch or assembly, has ultimate authority, right? And he says that the ultimate end of the sovereign is to ensure the safety of the people. And he goes on to say that he's just not talking about just basic safety, right? So, protection of their lives. He's actually talking about in a much more broad sense, right? So talking about the general welfare, making sure people can actually flourish and thrive, and industry can thrive in society. So that's the ultimate end of the sovereign, right? So how does the sovereign do it? Well, the sovereign creates and educates people on good laws, right? And so what exactly is a good law? Well, he says it's not only just, right? And he goes on to say that any law that the sovereign makes, because the sovereign has ultimate authority, is just, right? So according to Hobbes, there's no such thing as an unjust law that the sovereign makes. Everything the sovereign does, they have the legitimate authority to do, right? But he says, so justice is not the criteria for a good law, but for Hobbes, the criteria for a good law is it has to be that which is needed, right? Because what's the quote that he says? Let's see. He says that men are easy to be seduced and drawn to resist him, the sovereign, when the commonwealth shall require their use and exercise. Right? So that's why it's important that not only are the laws made, but they have to be taught as well. Right? So, okay, so what are the duties of the sovereign? What does the sovereign actually do? Well, the first and most important duty of the sovereign is that the sovereign never transfers or gives away their authority to somebody else or something else, right? The sovereign must stay in power, right? And the sovereign has the ultimate power, right? Which means that, um, whatever the sovereign does essentially is better than life was in the state of nature. So it's just, right? So the people don't have the right to revolution under Hobbes's picture with the sovereign, right? They essentially have to follow what the sovereign says. The second duty of the sovereign is to educate the people on the necessity of the sovereign, right? Because Hobbes says, look, people have a tendency to forget these things, right? If they haven't lived through the state of nature, they don't understand the dangers that are inherent in that state of nature. So it becomes necessary for the sovereign to educate, and they do that. The sovereign does that through making laws. The sovereign has to equally administer justice, right? So he says it can't just be the rich or the poor, that receive justice. It has to be equally administered. The sovereign is responsible for the application of punishments and rewards, taxation, obviously. Hobbes, if you do think that he's not completely draconian, because he says that, look, the sovereign should be responsible for providing for the welfare of those who can't take care of themselves. So even Hobbes thought welfare was not necessarily a bad thing. And then the final thing that he mentions is the sovereign has a duty to choose good counselors. Right? Okay. So just real quick, there's a lot in this chapter. I think this is particularly interesting and particularly telling if you look at Hobbes's 10 commandments of sovereignty, right? So you can call this like our David Letterman top 10 list. So according to Hobbes, here are the top 10 commandments of sovereignty, right? And you'll notice a lot of parallels between his commandments and the commandments, the 10 commandments, right? So commandment number 1, thou shalt not have another king before me, right? So essentially, the sovereign is the king, and there are no other sources of legitimate authority in the society, and don't seek them out, right? Because just as the Old Testament God was wrathful, so is the sovereign. Thou shalt not raise up any false citizens above me, right? So if you see somebody in society you think's really amazing, you think they'd be a great leader, and they're just this very charismatic, they're not more important than the sovereign, right? The sovereign the buck stops with the sovereign. Thou shalt not speak negatively about the sovereign, right? So this whole free speech thing, this, bashing President Obama, bashing the presidential nominees, that doesn't fly. Doesn't fly with Hobbes, right? Thou shalt assemble from time to time to praise the sovereign, right? Because people forget, it's important that we get people together. And he references the Sabbath and how people get together for church on Sundays or one day a week to not to praise God, but to praise the sovereign. So people can be reminded of how great the sovereign actually is. And then a lot of the other ones are taken directly from the 10 Commandments, right? So thou shalt honor thy father and mother, because the father and the mother play an important role in educating the kids about how important the sovereign is and why it's important to follow what the sovereign says, right? And he even says the father serves as a form of model of the sovereign that's going to help educate the citizens about sovereignty. And he says you can't commit violence, and he says, he goes through the whole list: no murder, no adultery, no stealing. You shouldn't lie, right? You shouldn't bear false witness against the sovereign. Don't lie about the sovereign. Be honest about the sovereign. And then the last one is sort of taken from the New Testament. Thou shalt love thy neighbor, right? So he says you have to have this genuine love. It's not enough to just sort of not do these things because you're afraid of retribution, but you need to genuinely not want to do these things, right? So that's what Hobbes thought about sovereignty, right? That's what he thought people needed to be educated about the sovereign. Then the rest of the chapter he just goes through sort of his different procedures for choosing good counselors and how taxes should be levied, and things punishments and rewards should be levied out. So I don't know. I think the Ten Commandments gives you a pretty good sense of how Hobbes thought about sovereignty. Sovereignty was it. It was the top, right? And you don't speak bad about sovereignty. No matter how bad the sovereign is, it's better than being in the state of nature, right? So the film for this week is V for Vendetta, and I want you guys to look and see if the society that's portrayed in V for Vendetta is reminiscent of all of what Hobbes is talking about here with these 10 commandments of sovereignty, right? Do you think Hobbes would be down with the society that's portrayed in V for Vendetta? Don't forget the midterm. I'll post an announcement that it's coming up as well. Just have a look over your previous quizzes, look over the previous discussions, and that should give you a good sense of what we're actually going to be looking at for the midterm. And I will post some discussion questions, or I'm sorry, paper topics to get you to start thinking about your final papers probably next week. So anyway, I hope you have a good week. If you have any questions, let me know. Hopefully the audio works this time.